Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. Today, we're imagining what an economic reality might look like under a Stein, Trump, Clinton, or Johnson administration. It's the economy, stupid, right? But who even knows what that really means? Whose economy? Is it rigged? If so, by who? For what reason? How do we know it is? Is the economy stupid, or is it us because we simply don't understand its so-called natural laws? Is there a free market? If so, who freed it? For what reason? For who? Are there other people or policies trying to enslave it again? And how can we stop them if they are? What is and what should be the role of government? What is big government? Is it the problem or the solution? Class consciousness, false consciousness, what should we be conscious of? How does consciousness translate into economic production, unemployment rates, ecological survival? What sort of consciousness will bring about a just economic world? Is that even possible or necessary? The invisible hand. If it's invisible, how do we know it exists? Workers of the world unite? Toward what end? What is the connection between moral terms like economic justice, ecological sanity, structured and institutional racism, and economic policy? Workers' cooperatives. And maybe the most important question of them all, how will any of this get paid for? By who and why? The list seems endless. Economics seems more and more confusing to more and more Americans as levels of fears for their economic futures seem to be escalating into higher levels of violence, fury, the pressure, and the need to create scapegoats for perceived problems and anxieties. Today, we're extremely fortunate to have a senior scholar from the Levy Economics Institute and a professor of economics at Bard College, who will shed light on what is sometimes referred to as the dismal science of economics. He will guide us around the numerous pitfalls and treacherous seas that usually surround presidential campaigns to take us to the calmer waters of understanding and realpolitik policy. We're so grateful to have Randall Wray here, and thank you so very much, Randall, for joining us here on the Radical Imagination.
Thanks for having me on.
Great, Randall. So, am I correct here? I know I was sort of having fun here a little bit with the opening, but are we so confused about the economy? And if so, why are we so confused? Are we so fearful as a country, as a world? And are those fears well-founded? How can the discipline of economics give us some rational understanding and hope?
Well, unfortunately, for the past, I would say at least 4 decades, economists have actually been trying to do the opposite. They've been trying to mislead people. They have created an entire discipline that has almost nothing to do whatsoever with the real world. And the consequences are that people are confused, and what they think they know is almost entirely wrong.
So you are really agreeing with my opening statement there. Now, for the last 4 decades, how did this get started? Why is this occurring, and how can we begin to turn this around here so people do have some understanding and some real understanding of what is going on in that real world out there? What does that mean, that real world? What is, in fact, the economy?
Well, I think that it really boils down to a reaction against New Deal economics that came in with Roosevelt, which was largely based somewhat after the fact on Keynesian economics, the economics of John Maynard Keynes, and other great economists of the past. So, beginning in the late 60s, there was a reaction against this, and it just sort of built strength until it completely took over the discipline, by the time of Jimmy Carter. And so, most of economics has become, I would say, little more than apologetics for what serves the interests of the top 1% or top tenth of 1%. And so that basically is what the discipline has become. And it's hidden behind mathematics and simplistic modeling. I mean, simplistic in the sense that the economy that it is describing is completely imaginary and extremely simple. The mathematics is very complex, which is very useful for hiding what they're doing.
Interesting, interesting. So then what you're talking about is an obfuscation of a reality that, of course, most people are really living through. Their fears are well-founded. And in a sense, the confusion is necessary so that the rich and the super rich can continue their control and domination. Is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So this sort of the worship of this metaphor, the free market, the invisible hand.
Tell us what that means. Where did those references come from?
Well, it's attributed to Adam Smith,
Okay.
who is called the father of economics.
Okay.
There were economists before Smith, but Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, 1776, tried to sort of lay out the discipline. Now, I say it's attributed to him. It's very doubtful he had anything like what is attributed to him in mind. He, as far as I know, only used the term the invisible hand twice. And it could have been interpreted as the invisible hand of God, not the market. So
Really? Huh.
but it is attributed to him, and everyone gives credit to him for coming up with this term. And Smith did say good things about the market. I don't want to mislead anyone. But this idea that the market forces are all good, that they are always pushing us toward equilibrium, toward the maximum happiness for everybody, has become absolutely dominant in economics. But outside of economics, you hear virtually all policymakers, singing odes to the market all the time, treating it as if it's, almost human. The market wants this, the market doesn't want that, and so on.
Godlike properties,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Yeah.
right. And beyond that, a great fear that if we were to do anything that might, say, benefit working people, raise the minimum wage $15 an hour, oh, no, we can't do that because the market won't like it. The market is an extremely fragile thing. It could destroy the market by raising the wage to $15 an hour, or virtually any other policy that you can think of that might benefit anyone other than the top 1% is pretty much dismissed out of hand because the market won't like it. And the market is very fragile, which, if you think about it, if that were true, let's say that the market were that fragile and that capitalism was such a phenomenally weak system that it couldn't withstand some regulation and some interventions that might help the vast majority of people, it's a system we wouldn't want. It's a system that wouldn't survive. It's a system that would be very easy to get rid of. But in reality, it's a very robust system. It's a very difficult system to get rid of, as the Soviet Union discovered, as Communist China discovered. And now, I'm not praising capitalism or anything like that. I'm just saying that if what everyone feared were true, it should have been very easy to get rid of capitalism, to put it down and completely destroy it. But that was not done. It didn't happen. It seems to me that the capitalist system is extremely strong.
Okay, so we have a very diverse and sophisticated audience here, but again, let's really stick to basics here. You mentioned Keynes.
Keynes.
Help us a little to understand his influence and what he was talking about in terms of reaction to the so-called full-blown acceptance of the market.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and Keynes did reject that. He wrote a pamphlet in 1926 called The End of Laissez-Faire, in which he said, this belief that the invisible hand works and we can rely on the market to guide us toward equilibrium, he said it's false. He says, actually, economists don't even believe it. He blamed political scientists for pushing this idea that it was really only politicians and political scientists who believed this, and it was an agenda, not good economics. So that was 1926. In 1936, in the depths of the Great Depression, he came out with his great book, The General Theory. And that book is really given credit for developing the field that we call macroeconomics, which is the study of the economy as a whole. And the way I always summarize this for students, Keynes's insight, I mean, when I state it this way, you're going to say, oh, that seems too simple. That couldn't be it. He said, look, firms only Firms only hire the number of workers they think they need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell. Now that seems simple, but it was revolutionary. What this means is that lowering wages is not going to reduce unemployment. So we're sitting in the Great Depression. We have unemployment rate of 25%. And the mainstream economists were calling for wage reductions in order to reduce labor costs. So
Austerity, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And it went beyond that. Andrew Mellon, who was the Treasury Secretary, said, we need to liquidate labor. We need to liquidate everything in the economy, push down wages, push down prices, and then everything will be okay. But Keynes is sitting there looking, and the famous story is he went to Chicago and he saw that wages are falling and the unemployment rate is going up. And Keynes realized, well, of course, that's true. Right. If you lower wages, people's income is lower, their consumption is lower, firms will actually cut employment instead of increasing employment. So then he developed an economic theory to explain this in detail. Why lowering wages is not the answer to unemployment. He created the theory of effective demand. So what we need is sufficient effective demand to increase employment in order to get on the road to full employment and recovery. And there's a role for the government to play in raising effective demand. So this became what we all call Keynesian economics, the idea that the government needs to increase effective demand when you're below full employment. This was accepted by all economists after World War II. It was the dominant view. Now, it's questionable whether very many of the people who adopted that view understood very much of Keynes's book, The General Theory. It is a difficult book to read. Paul Krugman has admitted in his blogs that parts of it he can't understand at all. So I wouldn't say that Keynes's arguments were well understood, but that part of the argument was very well understood, and it was adopted by everyone, even by Milton Friedman after World War II. But gradually over time, we've come back to the views in 1926 that Keynes was arguing against in that pamphlet at the end of laissez-faire.
So, and you have Keynesian influence all through the 60s, right? With the attempts to build a great society, the various programs that would rectify past wrongs and so on. Is that correct? So this activism fostered by social movements, pressure from below, disenfranchised groups, the civil rights movement, war on poverty, welfare rights. This was also very important to add to the struggle. And all through the 60s, you had this government intervention, correct, in terms of setting up programs, policies that would rectify past wrongs and expand the rights and opportunities for those who've been shut out.
Yeah,
Is
let
that
me
fair?
just
Yeah,
let
go
me
ahead.
just quibble about one word. Let's
Sure.
not call it intervention. It's government support. It is
Government support. Okay.
the role of the government to support the economy. This is not an intervention. The market does not operate as if an invisible hand is guiding it. It actually operates precisely the opposite way. The market spins off into boom and bust. Without the government constraining the market, we would be in perpetual bubble and bust cycles, much worse than anything that we've had since the 1930s.
I see. Okay. And then you have this reaction, as you pointed out, the late 60s with the Nixon administration and consolidating the power during the Carter years and fully in the Bush years, right? I'm sorry, in the Reagan years, certainly.
Yeah, and the Clinton years.
Clinton years. So it called a number of other things such as supply side economics, trickle down economics. Tell us a little about what that was trying to do or what they meant by those terms.
Yeah, well, the supply side economics and trickle down were basically invented by the Wall Street Journal. They're just extreme versions of the good old neoclassical economics, which always was a supply side economics. The economics before Keynes, mainstream economics, I'm not including here the Veblen and institutionalists or Marx and the Marxists. They were not supply side economics. But neoclassical economics, the dominant approach at the time, was always supply side. It's just that what was invented by George Gilder and Jude Wanniski at the Wall Street Journal is a much more extreme and very open version in which the idea is you stimulate the top 1% or 1/10 of 1%, make them extremely rich and extremely happy, and something will trickle down to the rest of us. And the something is supposed to be in part jobs. So you make the rich extremely rich. And what they will do is they'll save a lot of their riches, and they'll use some of that to invest in order to increase production, which will create jobs. It doesn't work, and it's not surprising to any Keynesian that it won't work, because you don't want more saving to stimulate production. What you want is more spending to stimulate production. And so enriching the rich, who largely save, doesn't do anything to stimulate jobs.
The Kennedy years. Kennedy is what, a transition figure because he argued rising tide would lift all boats. So was he committed to the sort of Keynesian economics that you're talking about, or not really?
Well,
It's Johnson who really brings that about.
Yeah, the Kennedy's advisors were Keynesians in name, and they were the same people with LBJ. Yes, they were broad brush Keynesians. Now, were they true followers of Keynes? I would argue no. I am not in that group of mainstream 60s Keynesians. But they did accept that you need to increase effective demand. Now, ironically, the policies pursued by Kennedy and to some extent Johnson were also supply side. Generally, every time we had a business cycle downturn, the knee-jerk reaction is tax cuts. And tax cuts were justified on the basis of supply side economics. It will make business happier and they will invest more. It certainly wasn't just a Keynesian economics. There always was a supply side streak in this. Let's make business very happy, and that will be good. The rising tide lifts all boats argument has a good aspect and a bad aspect. Uh, the idea that increasing aggregate demand is going to create jobs is sound. It is Keynesian. The idea that that's all you need to do to help the people at the bottom, because the rising tide will lift all boats, was I think, a cop out. We needed to do much more to help those at the bottom. Our war on poverty failed because it relied too much on the idea that if you pump up, let's say, the defense sector, you spend a lot on military hardware, the jobs will trickle down to the bottom. Well, they don't. They did not trickle down. And what happened was that at the very top end of the wage scale, you get wages going up and jobs are plentiful for highly skilled, trained, educated workers. And the wages are a bit up there. We start to get a bit of inflation, and then the policymakers get worried about inflation and they want to cut back. So you have sort of a go, stop, go policy. What we should have done is had many more programs specifically targeted to the bottom, creating jobs where they are not trickling down. We never did that. This is one thing I really like about Jill Stein's platform. Sorry, I don't want to jump into this, but
we want you to. We're going to get into all of that. Yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
In the 60s, it really doesn't work. My colleague here at BART, Pavlina Chernova, has shown that you go all the way back to the early post-war period, every economic recovery benefits the top more than it benefits the bottom. And this is increasingly true, so that our recovery from the global financial crisis of 2007, more than 100% of all the gains have gone to the top 10%. Absolutely nothing has gone to the bottom 90%. This is extreme, but this sort of split is normal. And if you think about it for a second, why wouldn't it be true? Why wouldn't the better off do better in a recovery? They'll grab more. And but that goes against the rising tide lifts all boats, which was sort of the mantra during the Kennedy Johnson administration. We don't need to do more for the poor because the rising tide lifts all boats. Well, it doesn't. It lifts the yachts. It doesn't lift the boats. You need more.
So it's a fantasy and a fiction. So what about some of the more radical elements, particularly in the 60s? Cloud and Piven's efforts to create a welfare rights movement that would hopefully lead to a destruction of welfare and a substitution of a guaranteed annual income. Tell us a little about that. Those efforts, are those the sorts of efforts you're talking about? Maximum feasible participation by the poor themselves in these programs. What are some of the neo-Marxian strains that you can identify during this period, if any?
Okay, yeah, well, that just really isn't my area.
Okay.
I've done lots of work on the job guarantee. I have been engaged on panels discussing or debating, if you prefer, a job guarantee versus a basic income guarantee.
Okay.
And my position is this: look, the vast majority of poor people want to work. Why just give them income? Why not give them a job? Let them participate. You talked about participation. Working is participating. It's a big part of participation in society. We should give anyone who wants to work a meaningful job.
Absolutely, but can't you also have a guaranteed annual income as well as in some of the Scandinavian countries? There's also absolute, adherence to work there too. Belief that is as important as you're pointing out. It's not one or the other, is it? Or
it does not have to be one or the other.
Right.
What I would do is I would first offer a job, meaningful work, contributing to society at a living wage to anybody who wants to work. and then let's see what's left, and let's
Okay.
take care of that. I
Okay.
do support, uh, without any reservation at all, child allowances. I think every industrialized country in the world, and last time I looked, there were something like 67 of them, except the United States, has a child allowance.
Hmm.
There should be a child allowance, and it should be significant so that no child lives in poverty. There's absolutely no excuse for not doing this.
Okay.
Every other society, industrialized society, does this. Okay, so I would add that on, absolutely. And of course, we have to take care of people who cannot work, who should not work, who don't want to work. Absolutely. Uh, Jill Stein's platform argues that everyone ought to have, as a human right, adequate food, clothing, shelter, and access to public utilities. Absolutely, I agree with that. So I would supply all of those things. Um, the idea that we're going to give everyone in America an adequate income so that they could have a true choice to not work if they don't want to, which would have to be, I would say, $25,000 to $40,000 for each American to actually give you that choice, that you could have virtually full participation in society but choose not to work. That is going to have a huge impact on the economy. And I don't think that any of the basic income guarantee proponents have adequately dealt with the questions about that.
Who's going to
We,
pay? How are we going to
I'm
get
not worried
have the
about
money
who's
for
going to
that?
pay.
Yeah.
I know how we can pay for this. What I'm worried about
Mm.
is that we are instantly going to increase aggregate demand by an amount that is beyond our current capacity to produce, which means we're going to get inflation and we're going to greatly increase imports. Um, because from day one, you've got $25,000 to $40,000 more this first year than you had last year. And you're going, except for the truly rich, you're going to spend a very large proportion of that. It's a huge increase in aggregate demand. So that's what I'm worried about. I would rather provide a job uh, to those who don't have jobs now, and then provide income to those who should not, cannot, or will not work.
Understood. Help us understand the so-called debate or dialogue that we're having this presidential candidate campaign. You mentioned Jill Stein. Jill was on 2, 3 weeks ago on this show. Um, does she represent what, a continuation of Roosevelt, New Deal, Great Society? Is she a continuation of Bernie Sanders' efforts to right the rigged economy? How does she differ from Bernie? How does she differ from Hillary Clinton?
Huge difference from Hillary Clinton.
Okay.
So, yeah, when I read, I'm an economist. I don't follow politics probably nearly close enough. Um, when I read through her issue statement and the platform, uh, there's virtually nothing here that's shocking. It is all, yeah, good Rooseveltian New Deal. It's very hard to see anything in her platform that any progressive wouldn't support. Uh, there's nothing radical here. There are some things I have some quibbles with, and some of these seem like a little bit, maybe a little too much micromanagement, and you need to hear more details about how we're going to do it. Uh, some of these are very uh, big goals, such as as part of the Green New Deal, that by 2030 we're going to have 100% clean, renewable energy. I
Hmm.
don't know if we can do that,
Right.
but I see this as sort of similar to the going to the moon. Yeah, it's why not set the goals high and then let's do our very best to try to reach them. So people might say this is pie in the sky, but everyone thought that too about going to the moon, and we did it easily. So I think that the platform, virtually every item on it, any progressive would support. And the big goals, they are worth striving for. There's a lot here about human rights, which are, I think, they've always been part of the progressive platform. Many of them are in the UN Charter for Human Rights. The United States has been ignoring them since, well, 60 years. They're things that we should be striving for. I like the notion of aspirational human rights. You set the goals high. The United States in the very beginning said all men and women are created equal. That's an aspirational right.
Right.
Have we achieved it? No, but we've made some progress. And she enumerates a lot of the human rights that we ought to be striving for.
So now, but you've also mentioned here, Hillary has portrayed herself, positioned herself as a progressive also. So what is that about? What is she truly representing economically, do you think?
Well, until she was pushed by Bernie Sanders' campaign, I rarely saw anything very progressive coming from Hillary Clinton. I see her as in this line trying to downsize people's expectations. So, no, we can't have single payer health care. No, we can't have health care as a human right. We have to settle for running it through the insurance industry. It seems to me that she sees her role as, apologetics, making excuses for why we can't aim bigger anymore.
And therefore, a natural ally of Wall Street and the financial sector, the 1%, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
she continues the deficit hawk line, which Bill Clinton followed. They're so proud that they managed to run budget surpluses that killed the economy. And there's every indication that she will be a budget hawk if she's elected, which was always the Republicans' campaign platform. This was not the Democrats. It's not a Keynesian position. It makes no economic sense to argue for balancing the budget and trying to reduce budget deficits when you've got so many people unemployed, when the bottom 90% of the population hasn't even gotten back to where they were before the Great Recession started. It makes no sense to be talking about reducing budget deficits.
This is really helpful, Randall. I think it's really very helpful how you differentiated between these two paradigms. How about now, of course, the enigma that is Trump? What is he presumably representing here? Where is he this traditional Republican, and why does some within the ruling elite see him as such a threat? What's going on there?
Boy,
Hard
it
to
is.
know, right? I know.
It's very difficult to understand. He had said some things that I was very glad were getting out there and getting coverage. That he loves debt, for example, talking about the budget, the government budget. And so I thought, maybe he can move the conversation a bit so that we don't have everything so one-sided with everything in the mainstream media about how we need to reduce the budget deficit and how the government debt is the worst possible thing out there. So Trump actually made sense on that. But I don't know, it just seems like he has melted down. it's beginning to look like he's not going to be able to mount a campaign.
How about these ideas of trade policies, which he's also tried to appeal to Bernie's followers?
Yeah.
Is he? What's the purpose there? What is he trying to get at there?
You know, I have heard that he's long been against these. I don't know whether that's true or not. These trade deals are terrible. Mostly to protect very rich and corporations. Basically, that's what it's about. It has virtually nothing to do with trade. Even NAFTA had virtually nothing to do with trade from the perspective of the United States, because we already had virtually free trade with Mexico and Canada. So these are all about protecting patents and trademarks and so on, which is not in the interests of the vast majority of Americans. It really wasn't these deals. It's a much longer term trend toward breaking down protections for American workers and not creating replacement jobs. There is no simple solution to this. I know that progressives really want to bring back manufacturing jobs and all that. I think that is looking backwards, and we need to look forward. Manufacturing is never going to be a significant source of jobs in the United States or in any other rich country outside of some very specialized areas that can work for smaller nations. For the United States, that's not a path to decent jobs for most Americans. We have to recognize that we are largely a service economy. There's nothing wrong with that. We can create good jobs in the service sector, and we can pay whatever wages we want for the most part, because a large part of the service sector doesn't compete with low-wage labor elsewhere, either because the labor needs to be here in the United States or because it requires skills and education. So that's where we ought to be focusing. Public infrastructure is another area where obviously at least a large part of the workers have to be here for the public infrastructure investment. You can maybe import some of the inputs to the infrastructure, but a lot of it has to be done by American workers in construction. So we ought to be focusing on those areas. But yeah, I think you're right that both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are capturing this tremendous discontent because we are losing our middle class, especially the middle class who relied on jobs in manufacturing or related to manufacturing, and our error is in not replacing them with something else.
Right. Now, let's add the final campaign here to our analysis, the Johnson libertarian perspective. What do they add to the economic debate in particular?
Well, I don't know anything specific about him or his
less
policy.
Government, smaller government.
In general, right.
In general,
so,
right.
In general, I can say that there are some things about there are some connections between human rights advocated by libertarians and privacy. Say Jill Stein's platform, right? More privacy, less government surveillance, less Big Brother, all that stuff, which is I think appealing. But the economic policies of libertarians are basically an extreme version of what we've been talking about. Right. That you just leave, they have a much more idealistic view that if you got the government out of the business of protecting big corporations and big banks, that we could be an economy with small enterprises competing with each other and with none of them having too much power and so on, which I think that the facts of experience tend to dispute that. That what happens is that in sector after sector and microsector after microsector, you get a handful of firms that rise up and take over and dominate that sector. The government is, in a sense, always involved, but I think that that would happen even without the government protection for them. So I think that it's a very idealistic view. And what we need instead of getting rid of the government is a government that actually operates in the interest, in the public interest. That's much preferable to me.
Your colleague and friend Stephanie Kelton has been on this program in dialogue with Richard Wolff, and I just emailed Rick today. He's going to be on the show again. But let me ask you this: in terms of Marx, in terms of some sort of indigenous, radical American neo-Marxian analysis here, it seems that Rick is certainly talks about things like workers' cooperatives, for example, that no other really mainstream economist is talking about. So what about the role of Marx generally? Its influence or lack of influence within the American political economic structure. Why has that been so minimal, if you will?
I really don't know. I mean, obviously there have been attacks on Marxists in academics, in labor unions, beginning with the Turner raids, if not before that. So that makes it very difficult. And in American academics, Marxism just plays almost no role. Much less here than in other countries where Marxism is a perfectly acceptable discipline in economics, taught alongside neoclassical and Keynesian economics. That's just not true in the United States in economics. I understand outside the discipline of economics, you can teach Marx, but in economics, it is just really not acceptable, not done.
So democratic socialism, in a sense, is about what we've been able to push the narrative toward. Is that, I mean, with Bernie and Jill Stein, in a sense, Martin Luther King identified himself as a democratic socialist. But that's about it. That's sort of the parameter within which American economic theory gets discussed, right?
Yeah, that would be the far edges.
The far
fringes.
edges, exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And so you identify, you call yourself a post-Keynesian economist, is that correct? And if you will, tell us a little about your own work.
Okay. Background was institutionalist, which is the followers of Veblen, and post-Keynesian, the followers of Keynes. So post-Keynesians claim to be the true followers because they actually read the general theory and try to understand what Keynes actually wrote, rather than people like Krugman, who use the name but either don't try hard enough or for some reason can't understand what Keynes actually wrote. So those are the traditions I work in and work on. Mostly money and banking, financial institutions, and I suppose that Stephanie Kelton talked about modern money theory, that
Yes.
a handful of us have developed that over the past 20 years. So that's an area. I was a student of Hyman Minsky. When the global financial crisis hit, several prominent people, including Krugman, called it a Minsky crisis. So Minsky was sort of the father of the global financial crisis, not in the sense that he caused it, but in the sense that he warned that it was coming. And he developed a theory of crises and
Crises management, right? Is that what you're?
well, not well.
Or
Hopefully,
response or
you can you can postpone them. He wouldn't say that you could ever get rid of them, but you could postpone them, and you could make them less worse than they otherwise would be by putting in place the proper institutional constraints. So I talked about the invisible hand, and so mainstream economics sees the market as stabilizing. Minsky argued exactly the reverse. The market itself is unstable. You need stabilizing institutions. A lot of those come from government regulations, rules, supervision of financial institutions, and so on. And some of them come from the private sector itself. But it's the institutions that constrain. So actually, the market left to its own devices would be extremely unstable. Nobody would tolerate it. You could not have a market-based economy if you let the market do its own thing. You have to constrain that instability with the institutions. So it turns the whole mainstream argument on its head. And after the crisis, a lot of people have looked at his work. I just published a book, Why Minsky Matters, with Princeton, that tries to describe in very simple terms the Minskyan view of this. And a number of people have really tried to seriously understand this, and it is, I think, having some impact on the way that we're moving forward. Now, it had no impact on policymaking in Washington. They basically patted Wall Street on its behind and said, go back to doing what you've been doing because you do such a great job. But there are people now who understand and who are, I think, warning about the next crisis, which could be pretty soon.
Let me ask you a series of questions that are connected to one of the major themes of this program, radical imagination. We talk a variety of with a variety of shows, in a variety of shows. We've talked about spiritual progressives and the connection between values, moral perspectives, and such things as economics and politics and so on. What role do you see, what connections do you see between economic theory, policy, practice, influence, and the issues of morality and value judgments in terms of militarism, in terms of ecological sanity, racial discrimination? To what extent can we address these issues, these moral issues, at an economic level as well?
Well, you probably know that economics originally was called moral philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah.
From Adam Smith. Keynes himself wrote on morality. Keynes's biographer, Robert Skidelsky, Lord Robert Skidelsky, has written a series of books, I think mostly after he finished the biography of Keynes, on the morality of our current system. And Keynes really worried about a system in which money becomes the only object. And he looked forward. He wrote about the economic possibilities for our grandchildren when we would no longer worry about money. So this really should be part of economics. Is not part of mainstream economics at all. The market is right, so you don't need to worry about that. But in heterodox economics, the dissenters who follow Marx, Veblen, Keynes, and others do worry about these things. If capitalism, capitalism has only one object, which is to make money, then it's not an acceptable system. So we need to make sure that there's more than that. capitalism, needs to deliver the goods too. It needs to deliver a decent living standard for everyone. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be democratic, democratically controlled. It needs to be a progressive force. Adam Smith argued in 1776 that capitalism was a progressive force against feudalism. And it seems, in spite of all, he pointed out many bad things about capitalism, what it was doing to the working class. And then Marx carried on with that. So at least at one point in time, capitalism was very progressive. But it's not delivering the goods now. For very large proportions, even of the richest economy on earth, which is ours, it's not delivering the goods. And it's not because it can't. It's not because we're incapable of producing the goods and services, the food, clothing, shelter, education, healthcare, and so on. We can. There's, I think, no question about this. Our problem is in the policies that are ignoring huge parts of the population and favoring very small groups of extremely wealthy people and well-connected people. Jamie Galbraith, the son of John Kenneth Galbraith, who's another in the institutionalist tradition following Veblen, wrote a book a few years ago, The Predator State, which was about the Bush-Cheney administrations, but it could apply to Clinton and Obama administrations too, that the connections between a handful of self-interested institutions and the government are too tight, where they are predating on the government sector. And this whole flack about the Clinton Foundation, it looks like they have ramped this up from what the Bushes were able to do. It looks like the Clintons have a much more successful strategy of predating on the state and rewarding themselves through this predation. So this is very, very scary.
I couldn't agree with you more. We're winding down in the last couple of minutes, and you're really getting down to some incredibly powerful, profound points and questions. You do, obviously, capitalism can produce. It has been the most productive economic system in the history of the world. But again, the moral issue of what to do with that is something that capitalism itself seems to be incapable of answering.
Yeah, well, I think that is true. And
so what are we left with here in the last minute or two? Social movements outside the economic system, pushing it toward these moral goals of the great masses of people?
Yeah, well, certainly we need social movements.
Right.
And, we need a government that serves the public interest. I did support the Bernie Sanders movement. I didn't agree with everything, but I am hoping that continues. I think you do have to push the policymakers in the right direction. We need to provide the constraints that are necessary to get our capitalist economic system to behave in a moral manner, protecting people, but also protecting the environment. And there's no reason to believe that the market itself is going to do that, and there's very good reason to believe that it won't.
Right, right. People over profits. Well, Randall, this has really been enlightening. I want to thank you so very, very much for an incredible analysis and dialogue. And I want to thank you so very, very much for appearing on The Radical Imagination. I know our audience has really appreciated your input and your articulate and passionate understanding that you've been able to give us. So thank you again very, very much, Randall. And thank you all for watching today on The Radical Imagination. See you next week. This is Jim Vrettos, your host on The Radical Imagination.